to go ahead and start.
Yeah, that'd be great. So I am Peter Lawrence from the Terrestrial Sciences section here at NCAR. And one of the things I talked about today is looking at the role the land surface has in the climate system. And so we can see that the land surface is very diverse. It covers about a third of the planet's surface. And what we see is we have ranges from glaciers and mountains down through crops and forests. And they interact with the clouds and they produce energy and moisture that goes back up. So one of the things we look at in terms of what the land surface is doing is changes in surface energy fluxes. The amount of radiation that gets absorbed by the surface is affected by how much vegetation, snow, and soils, how much energy goes back out in terms of long-wave fluxes, heated. Latent heat flux, which are evaporative fluxes back to the atmosphere, we're really interested in those as well. And sensible heat flux, which is the thermal heat, how much heat gets transferred back. We look at the hydrology. We're interested in seeing how snow and rain basically interact with the surface, how trees intercept the rain, snowpack gets formed, runoff occurs, how plants return energy and moisture back to the atmosphere, and then how the soils look after all that moisture. We also look at deep aquifers in terms of how they store moisture for longer periods of time. Finally, looking at biogeochemistry, we wanted to see how plants take carbon dioxide and water and turn it into glucose and oxygen. Then they take this glucose and turn to carbohydrates, which go into leaves, roots, and wood in terms of plants. They then become litter and debris and soil carbon. And then finally, we look at decomposition and fire and how that removes it back out into the atmosphere. And the last thing is the nitrogen cycle. Humans are also changing this. So basically, humans come along and they change the whole natural system. They directly do this through wood harvest and forestry. They also clear the land for looking for crops. And what we do is we see that there is fluxes of carbon back into the atmosphere from these activities, which are being offset partially by things that are being drawn back into the ecosystem. So when we look at the direct impacts, we look at changes in the surface radiation. So we've got forestry and agriculture and urbanization, all these things happening here, changing the land surface. So we get changes in how much energy is being stored here, how much water is stored here and where it's returned to, and also the roughness, the drag the land surface has on the atmosphere. So these things are all being changed by humans. Then we look at the biogeochemical impacts. When we see the change from forests to agricultural systems, we see large losses of carbon back into the atmosphere. We also see that when we harvest forests, like in this process here, we're turning into wood products that return to the atmosphere, and we lose soil carbon out of as well. We're looking at changes in photosynthesis. So when we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, the plants become more active and they become more productive. We're also changing nitrogen and phosphorus through fertilizers and also through things that are being deposited there. We see changes in atmospheric responses. There's more heat going into the atmosphere from a drier surface, changes precipitation and large-scale influences. So we go back the last 150 years and look at what humans have actually done. We see, looking at forests, we see large-scale decreases in forests across the planet. These are predominantly being replaced by crops. But we also see that there are large areas where like prairies have become cropped and other areas where we've opened up forests for pastures. Now in terms of the total emissions from all this activity, we see this red line here is basically land cover change. And it actually represents 1/3 of the carbon that humans have put in the atmosphere in the last 150 years. We see this not until the 1950s actually that fossil fuels take over as the dominant effect. Keep on going. Okay, so if we look out to the future, we have possible scenarios going to 2100 for the last IPC climate report. We have reforestation scenarios here where we're increasing trees and decreasing crops versus one where we're actually still continuing to decrease trees and increasing cropping lands. So I just want to keep those two in mind. There's this idea that we're going to have a reforestation scenario, which is this red one. Now what we see is the reforestation scenario returns a lot of the carbon back from the atmosphere back into the land surface. In fact, a lot of the carbon that we've lost through the historical period can be returned through reforestation. But if we continue deforesting at this rate, we end up losing more and more carbon. And in fact, these emissions get higher and higher than from the historical increases. So now moving gears and changing, we also look at urbanization and how humans are changing the landscape by building these urban canyons. We trap heat in the urban canyon. We change the hydrology because we've got impervious surfaces. All this sealed area changes the amount of moisture that can be returned to the atmosphere. And then the air gets trapped in the canyon as well. So what happens is when we do high-resolution modeling, we can see here is New York City and New Jersey, and this is Philadelphia. These high-resolution models, we can see in the winter we get this urban heat island effect occurring here and here. So these can be up to 5 degrees warmer inside the city than like the surrounding forested areas. So these changes have an impact on where people are living and what's happening. So it's good to have that in the winter, but not in the summer. Finally, the last one I wanted to show was like what happens with all this air pollution. This is China looking at the grey haze coming out here. This basically is being taken up to the north and ending up on the Greenland ice shelf. This is actually what happens with all that black carbon that's coming out of the power stations. Changes the whole albedo, the whole reflectivity of the ice sheet. This means more sunlight gets absorbed and it increases the heating and the melting. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff happening here. This is sort of like how the land surface impacts the climate system.
Any immediate questions? Anybody got a thought out there they'd like to get some more information on before we move on to our next speaker?
Are you able to trace the particulates on the ice sheet, especially in Greenland, to a particular source?
Right, that's actually a really good question. And there's actually a project going on now called Dark Snow where they actually are trying to do that. They're actually collecting these samples and trying to be able to source them back to the original places. But you don't have to be too sort of like a transport model to work out. A lot of it's coming from like the large increase in coal-fired power stations in China. You know, it's now, with half of the coal being burned in the world is now happening in China. And you look at those clouds, you see what's happened in the last couple of months in Beijing and like through central China, and the air quality there has got so poor. So yeah, it's a very good point.
Any other pressing questions? All right, save your thoughts and we'll come back to them in a second.